Good afternoon to you, and greetings from the campus of The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. My name is Scott Jones, and I am pleased to serve the university as both professor in the School of Music and director of the Lawrence and Isabel Barnett Center for Integrated Arts and Enterprise. We are delighted to have you with us today for this Creative Pathfinders event. A little bit about Creative Pathfinders. It's a series of virtual conversations that traces the careers and highlights the accomplishments of Ohio State Arts alumni. It was initiated in 2020 by then Director of the Barnett Center, Allison Cressetta, and it celebrates the accomplishments of our arts graduates and enriches our relationship with alumni from Ohio State, now a community of more than 600,000 worldwide. The series is a collaboration between the Barnett Center and a specific arts unit on campus, today the Art Department, and is supported by the Office of Advancement within the College of Arts and Sciences. A little bit about the Barnett Center for those of you who may be unaware. Created by a generous gift from the Barnett family, the Barnett Center educates and prepares students for successful careers in the arts and related entrepreneurial fields, while also advancing student understanding of arts management, policy, and culture through entrepreneurial thought and action. Our vibrant partnerships with each of the arts units and centers at Ohio State, other campus constituents, and the Columbus arts community are central to the mission of the center. The Barnett Center contributes to the curricular offerings focused on arts entrepreneurship and arts management by offering programs, working with students across disciplines, and housing the Barnett Fellows. For more information about the Barnett Center, please visit us at barnettcenter.osu.edu. Let's transition to the main event this afternoon, if you will, and let me share with you a little bit about the moderator for the conversation you're about to take part in, George Rush, who is an associate professor in the Painting and Drawing program in the Department of Art here at Ohio State. He received a BFA from the Maryland Institute College of Arts and an MFA from Columbia University School of the Arts. In addition to participating in numerous group exhibitions, since 2001, he has had solo exhibitions in New York, Copenhagen, Madrid, Miami, Santa Fe, and Michigan, just to name a few. He's received awards from the New York Foundation of the Arts and the Pollock Krasner Foundation. And for those of you who are either near or going to be possibly in Dayton, Ohio, starting here on May 5th and running through almost the end of July, is an exhibition of George's taking place at the Contemporary Dayton. It's an exhibition of almost 200 paintings that's been rolled out over the course of the last 3 years. This summer is the last installment, and we'll be sharing some information with you. A link, as a matter of fact, I think there it just went. If you're interested and are traveling near Dayton, Ohio, and would like to take in that exhibition, we encourage you to do so. Please welcome to our conversation this afternoon, George Rush.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Maddie, for inviting us to do this. It's really my great pleasure to introduce Zahar Vaks. Zahar, can you come up on the screen? Are you there? Yeah. Hi, Zahar. It's really a great pleasure to have Zahar visiting with us today, even if it has to be virtual. I was lucky enough to meet Zahar in 2010 when I came to Columbus to interview for the job I have now, and Zahar was a graduate student, and I was immediately struck by his intensity and his humor and his incredible generosity. And we went around the studios together, the graduate studios, and I remember the works actually that you were making at that time. And you know, in a way, what's been so interesting to me is I don't think I understood or got where you were coming from when I saw those works. And the work hasn't changed that much, but I've changed, and I've learned a lot about how to look at your work and how to understand your work. And I've grown to love your work. In fact, I have one of your paintings that you gave me a couple of years ago hanging right behind me, and it's usually in a different part of my dining room, but I wanted to put it up so that it was visible. So it's with great affection that I welcome you here today. And but you know, I also, of course, one of the things I'm so excited by is your way of centering your art, your painting amongst all of these different activities: performance, video work, playing the violin, cooking, magic, if you will, transformation, and that's expanded as I've known you into. You're now a co-director of Ortega y Gasset. You've curated many exhibitions, and you're teaching. And so I'm super excited to talk about all those things and how they intertwine. Zahar graduated from Tyler School of Art in 2006. After living in New York for a few years, he came out here to OSU and got his MFA. At that point, it was only a 2-year program. We're now a 3-year program in 2011. He was at the Galveston Artist Residency, I think in their 2nd year, right? And as one of their first residents in 2012 and 2013. He was a resident in the Ruschenberg Foundation Residency in 2018. And he just finished a semester teaching and being a resident at University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He, as I mentioned, is a co-director of Ortega y Gasset and is joining us from his studio in Brooklyn. And welcome, Zahar. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for that really sweet introduction. And thank you to everybody for hosting me. And I'm excited to have this conversation.
Me too. I'm a little confused by Zoom, and I'm wondering, Maddie, Alex, and Scott, is it possible to hide the 3 of you? Like I see all of us. Maybe I'll just go to speaker view. That's better. There we go. Okay. I've only been teaching on Zoom for 2 years, so but it's like starting over every time. We set up a few questions, but and the first question that I had, and maybe it can then segue into you sharing with us some of your images, is you went to Tyler, you studied at Tyler, and then you took a couple of years off, and then you came to OSU. And I just think it's always really interesting to hear about that moment, right? The moment between undergraduate art school and going back to graduate school. And could you fill us in a little bit about what that was like, and why you decided to do it, and why you decided to come to OSU?
Absolutely. So right after Tyler, I moved to New York City and I started teaching full time. That was around the time when you're still able to teach with a certificate and not have to get a master's. And I was 22, 23. I started teaching in the South Bronx, and I got a studio here in Gowanus. And everything was just this whirlwind. And I was here. I had some friends in New York, but I didn't really have a community yet. And I really started going through this negotiating of being an educator, but teaching high school in a pretty rough school in the Bronx, and then taking the train over and going to my studio and trying to work. And I think maybe because I was younger, I was able to trick myself into just being super exhausted all the time, and definitely didn't sleep as much as I should have. But something that really helped navigate those two really difficult things was on the days that I would be super exhausted. So my 3rd year, right before, and this was actually the reason why I decided to apply to grad school eventually. But my 3rd year, I was living in Fort Greene in Brooklyn. I was teaching in the South Bronx, and my studio was in Long Island City at this point. So I was just always on the train. And, if I had a long day, like say it was a day full of meetings, you're depleted and you're exhausted. And I started tricking myself to show up on those days, knowing that I'm not going to get much done, knowing that and I still do this today, by the way. Like, this is something that still keeps me, helps me be in the conversation. But I would take the multiple trains to Long Island City from the Bronx. And then I would just show up to my studio, and sometimes I would just sit there and stare at my work for a half hour. Sometimes it would feel good to just sweep the floor, which we all need to do every once in a while, clean our room, as George would say. I think I heard you say that to someone back in the day. But that really helped me because I was taking on, it's not that I had much like admin work or anything like that back then. It was a lot of emotional stuff that I was taking home with me. Whether it was the stories that my students were telling me, the kind of environments that they were describing, and then wanting to connect and it got to a point where I was having like a reoccurring nightmare about my students. And that was really the moment where I was like, okay, I need to really focus on my studio practice and not continue to negotiate it this way. And I applied to 4 schools, and Ohio State and PAFA were the 2 that I got into. And at the end of the day, Ohio State gave me the better deal. But also, I then found out that my heroes were teaching at Ohio State. I had no idea that, like, at the time, Ann Hamilton was working there until I came to visit and saw like a DJ Spooky talk. And then my friend Talia, like, Ann Hamilton's here. And I was like, what? So I'm so happy with the decision. Not only is it an incredible research university with all of these options of who you can work with, it really dictated the kind of, it being a research school really dictated what kind of experience I had, and I think has a big part in the way that I now continue to negotiate an interdisciplinary practice in conversation with like a honed in soul painting practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the things I sort of mentioned this when I was introducing you, but I've always been interested in how painting does seem to be the kind of center of the practice. But you seem to also really explore what the definitions of painting are. Does painting begin by making the actual materials that you make the paintings with? I remember you making your own your own paint, really, using beet juice and other things. But then you were also making borscht, and then you were also playing music. And can you talk a bit about how that sort of, I always see it as a kind of, maybe there's a loose metaphor that I don't know how you feel about it, but as a kind of alchemical sort of process.
No,
that's why I mentioned magic before, but that there is this real sort of belief in the transformative power of not only material, but of art itself. And can you talk about how that developed while you were here, and then like where you've seen that go since?
Absolutely. I mean, I could start like the urge to explore the multi-sensory, right? That was a little bit before Ohio State, where I started using things like clove oil and lavender oil, and then later found out that clove oil had this medicinal component to it where people used it for to recover memory loss. And I was making work that was all about sensory recall. And those were like the seedlings to that exploration. That's also around the time where I was using beet juice and things like turmeric, and was just at the forefront. There was always this idea of like wanting to actualize a multi-sensory experience, whether it's through smell, and often it was through smell, specifically the smell of clove oil, or I actually have some of them here. These are actually from early 2006, right when I moved to New York. I have my marinated drawings and my cooked drawings. So the marinated drawings would be drawings with ballpoint pen that I would then trace over with clove oil. And then the cooked drawings were, they started off this way, but then I would dip them in beeswax, right? And it got to a point where I was teaching and my students were always throwing things out and were like making funny little like gang drawings. And I was like, those are great. Do you mind if I keep them? And they're like, sure. And then I would dip them into beeswax, respond to them. And then that led me to showing work on light tables, and then the heat from the light table would activate the scent.
Mm.
And that's what I was doing before getting to Ohio State. And then I get to Ohio State, and there's people like Ann Hamilton there, and they start, and Suzanne and Laura, and later you, George, like Allison. Everyone was in their own way encouraging me to explore, whether it was Suzanne and Laura urging me to explore within the painting practice,
Mm.
and then people like Anne that got me to embrace things that embarrassed me, things that I loved outside of painting that later I realized needed to be a part of the synthesized
Mm.
practice. So it was really at Ohio State where I started performing, where I
Mhm.
started incorporating the violin. And it was also, and in the beginning, it was just me trying to mesh everything together. And it was
Mhm.
also at Ohio State that I realized that it can't always be like that. And by
Mhm.
the time I graduated, I even talk about things like levels of fluency and
Mm.
acknowledging the different level of fluency and how they feed each other. So for me, my painting is the most consistent, right? Like I've been painting, there's a trajectory where my violin practice is very disjointed. I played
Mhm.
as a little
Mhm.
kid, my mom was a violinist, then I rebelled against it and stopped for a while. And by the time I was gravitating back towards it, I lost a lot of the technical ability, right?
Mhm.
Aside from, say, vibrato. But that was the thing that interested me. It was all of a sudden, it wasn't about mastering this thing. It was, how do I compare? How do I take what I do have with the violin? How do I talk about gesture using the violin and creating the vibrato the vibrato gesture in the violin that makes a certain sound? Then how does that same gesture carry over into my paintings? And I got to work with the Ohio State has an incredible dance department. So I got to work with folks like David Covey, who was there at the time, taught told me about lighting design and collaboration. And he was the lighting designer for Merce Cunningham. So that spirit was that collaborative spirit was, and again, it goes back to Ohio State being this research university where people are seeking each other out from different disciplines. And that very much had an impact on who I am as a painter. But when I left Ohio State, I I knew that there was a distinction, and that there was it was almost like cyclical. I I have moments where I need to just paint. And I experienced this just being at the University of Tennessee, the residency that I just did there. I got to experience and earlier when I was at Rauschenberg and then at Texas, when I do these residencies, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but when I have the amount of time that I need, when
Mhm.
I'm not distracted by admin tasks or teaching, I am able to naturally figure out my cycle, meaning like the next 2 months are, I feel it in my bones. This is painting time,
Mm.
nothing but painting. And then there could be a month or maybe more that creeps up where I'm shooting video or maybe performing. And then another month or so when I'm editing. And it's a whole different way of thinking, a different way of making. But more and more, I know that they are all connected. It's just they all need space and time to exist by themselves.
Mhm.
And even the videos themselves, I mean, the imagery, the way that I edit sound, the way that I edit color, it's still influenced by this rooted painting practice.
Yeah. Wow. Um, I'm keeping an eye on the time a little bit because
I could talk all day. I know. I'm sorry.
well, between the two of us, we'll really quickly burn this up. So, but I think a lot of people that are in the audience probably really want to hear a little bit about life after grad school. So do you have a couple of slides of the work that you made from your thesis show? And then maybe we can
Absolutely.
talk about GAR and
Definitely.
the
Let me
next
pull up
stage.
the thesis. I'm sharing my thesis with you all. That's part of the archive. Um, there are no spelling mistakes or grammar mistakes in this thesis. Uh, I hope. All right, so this is my archival work. Let me just get to the thesis. Okay, so it was titled Modes and Monikers. I was Zachary Podgorny at the time. That's my legal name. we'll talk about that later. All right, let me just move forward. So George mentioned like starting a painting, right? And building my own surfaces. So here's an example. This and this kind of thinking in a painting, I think still resonates with me today. Like taking multiple types of fabric or multiple types of surfaces and then fusing them. Like what happens when you put something that's like organza underneath like a rough linen? What kind of skin does that become? Right? And these slippages like this, like the linen, showing the edge of the linen and cutting it while treating the scrim, the organza, and the way that even though I'm using the same material and the same color, it reads differently on that softer fabric. Right. It was also my second year in grad school was also I was making these. I was continuing my exploration of the marinated drawings on things like photo paper. So this is clove oil on top of ballpoint pen from the back, and then it came through the paper, and then oil paint on top. And I was also working with a lot of drywall, and there was something really beautiful about taking found drywall, peeling off the paper, exposing the gypsum, exposing the fiberglass, digging into it, painting on top of it, and how like right away it started to feel like a fresco of some sort, right? And here's some of my abject moments with the beat tail and a little bit of fuzzy mold on top of that beat tail. It was all part of it. And there was something about working in this way that made me reconsider what the beginning of a painting is, right? Traditionally, we stretch a painting, right? We prime it, we gesso it, what have you, and then the painting begins, or at least that's how I used to think. And working in this way really, really allowed me to understand, and this kind of thinking is now carried over to even when I do stretch paintings, right? The painting begins as soon as you take your materials out. And the moment I broke the gypsum, the drywall, that painting started. And I don't know, now that kind of thinking, I think it just makes you consider everything, and there's no prep work. It's all the work. So similar, so some of the cousins of this work on drywall, this exploration also led me to, fragmenting my work and thinking about what a whole is and what a fragment is. And, is something whole even when it's taken apart and rearranged? Like what does that whole become? So those were things that I was super interested in. And again, just this feeling of using an everyday material that we see everywhere, and the fact that it could still look ancient, and or something like a fresco was really exciting for me. I'll move through this a little quicker. Some more paintings. This was just a big painting on linen. It was here's an example of my collaboration with some of the dance MFAs, and I ended up doing a backdrop for was it Betsy? Yes, I think it was Betsy, who was choreographing and directing a contemporary or a modernized take on La Parade. And I took the organza silks that I had, and I had some muslin, and I created the background for this piece, and the dancers and the movers were all interacting with it. And working this way, I think also, again, another moment where it was, it was painting, it was rooted in my painting, but the experience of thinking about them hanging in space this way started contributing to my interdisciplinary thinking, and the fact that these people were moving and responding to it. I also did some collaboration with my friend Dan Harvey, some of the first iterations of my violin playing, and a little bit of slapstick comedy. Shout out to Dan Harvey. So you can see I'm thinking about moving as a way to synthesize.
You know, humor is a huge part of the work. And I always think about, when I think about humor and transformation, I think a lot about how, or humor and alchemy are really important. Sort of, they coexist in a very important way. Where one of the important techniques of a sorcerer would be to confuse the everyday person into, so that you can't tell what's real and what's not, what's magic and what's banal, and so on. And can you talk a bit about the role of humor in your work and how you see it operating?
Yeah, for me, I think humor feeds my improvisation. I think it's aligned with like spontaneity and in that sense also my instinct. Like I never like, I'm not a joke writer, I'm not a comedian, but for me, like having a sense of humor, it helps me be a better teacher. But it also absolutely has an imprint on what my work is, whether it's painting, whether it's my use of video editing. I'm gonna share with you guys. I'm gonna send links to a feature, not feature, a short film that I made while responding to Knoxville, Tennessee, and it touches on the interdisciplinary practice, but it also touches on my surroundings, which was beautiful nature and also football bros. And I needed to have a sense of humor to weather the fact that they were right next door to me partying all the time, but also so I could get the kind of footage that I wanted to get. So I was able to slide in. I was like, "Hey everyone, I'm with Volts TV, and you're on camera." And then they end up being part of my film. Of course, I blurred the whole thing out because I later decided I didn't want them to be the face of the film. But yeah, I think humor is, for whatever reason, I'm still inclined to say that humor is very much tied to like the spontaneous and the improvisational, but also um, it's a way to talk about the serious things too. It allows me to talk about the serious things my own terms.
Boy, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm wondering if we could sort of jump forward a couple of months. So you've
Yeah.
gotten out of grad school.
Yep.
You've moved back to New York,
I
right?
moved back to New York. I started working for the Joan Mitchell Foundation. I was living in Greenpoint. It was great. It was a good year in New York. It was a hustle. And then I was invited to do the residency in Galveston, the Galveston Artist Residency, which was the first big residency that I received. And I'm going to share my screen now, but not this. Let's go to. Oh, I have it here. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and go to exhibitions.
So while you find that, I'll just say Galveston Artist Residency is in Galveston, Texas, right outside of Houston. It's an 11-month residency. They give you a beautiful studio and a nice little apartment and a bike and a show in this incredible gallery, and $1,000 a month, right?
Yeah. Yep. And just really wonderful, generous people that are running it. And it was a place for me to not only did I have the generosity of space and time, but also because it was so flexible, it was a place where I could just lock my doors and just be in my studio. But they would always have really amazing people coming through, and it wasn't always planned out. But here's a great composer that's going to be in town tomorrow. You want to meet with them? Of course, I want to meet with them, right? So it was a place where I was able to start building on the things that I discovered in grad school, right after having that year, and it just allowed me to lean into this interdisciplinary play. It was in Galveston that year, and I think this also was happening in that year before getting to Galveston, where for a while I stopped stretching canvases and I allowed myself to spill over into space. And I was still treating this work like they're paintings. For example, this had sound inside of it. These were almost like a speaker box. These were drywall pieces that, again, working with drywall became more sculptural. And then I started spilling out into the space using things like sand found in Galveston Beach, or beech wood found in around the area, and then wrapping them in fabrics. It just allowed me to think into the space as a painter. And I always had this stigma of like, anytime something was standing upright, or anytime something went into the sculptural realm, I always felt really shy about it. And I was like, oh, I'm not a sculptor. I'm not a sculptor. And Galveston was really the place where I was able to get away from that and just embrace working in this way. And then what excites me is when I did get back to New York, I was able to take what I learned here, right? So you have things like cayenne pepper infused with sand and these found objects that I'm painting on, but then I'm pressing into it. So I'm still thinking about painting and texture and mark, but now it was out in space. And then when I finally did yearn to stretch paintings again, whatever I learned here, I think came into my paintings too. And now the way that I treat the surfaces, like, I mean, I could show something that I'm working on currently, like the use of images or previous drawings, like the freedom that I have now to work on these canvases, I think really stems from this experience of really letting myself go. And it was also in Galveston where I made 3 films. I made 3 short films that stem from this interdisciplinary practice, and also were me responding to how weird Galveston is, just like I respond to how strange Knoxville is. And then, 2 years ago, how strange Captiva Island is when I was in Rauschenberg. So yeah, I get these things, and then there's this certain amount of time, and I'm able to really, I'm still surprised by how I like, it's almost like an internal clock or something. And like, I know that this is painting time, and then this is editing time, and then this is, performing time.
I never kind of made this connection before, but seeing this work, and especially with the floor pieces, makes me. Can you hear me? Makes me think that that you're responding very much to like a kind of tradition of landscape.
So I'm so happy you brought that up. It was in Galveston where I first started thinking about islands, right? And I think someone actually brought it up to me. Like, this whole thing was the fact that I was living on Galveston Island, and there's all these there's like this concrete ship somewhere out in the bay, and there's all these island-like references. And then I make an installation that's very much like an island. And then later, if you guys allow me to just, I'm actually gonna go ahead and to Ruschenberg Residency. I get to another place that was absolutely.
That was your studio at Rauschenberg?
This was my studio at Rauschenberg. And so, now these are works on the wall, right? But they're all taking a weird shape. They're going vertical. So it was a different kind of freedom, right? And again, the way that I was treating my surfaces, right? This is some of the work that I made in the Ruschenberg Residency. The way that I started treating these surfaces, especially this one, nonverbal specificity, I started thinking of like the silk fabrics that I was stretching, and the way that they bellow, and the way that they're so fragile. And I should preface this, the year I was in Rauschenberg was also the year where there was just a really heavy red tide. And I was seeing that the effect of global warming on this really beautiful exotic place. So you see thousands of fish on the shore. And again, I made a film that responded to that. But really, I started thinking about the same way that the clove oil was like a material metaphor for memory, and it linked up. Here, the silk and the kinds of fabrics I was using became a material metaphor for like a fragile island ecology, right? And the fact that I was experiencing it so closely, you could smell the red tide, you could see it. So again, this island, and then later, the way that I start painting my works, we go to 2019, where you see a lot of images from the film that I shot in Rauschenberg, and I had access to his silk screening press, and I was printing all these images and then wrapping them and infusing them into my paintings. So this is an image from the film that I then turned into the painting.
And
Or
when you say
something.
an image from the film, do you mean like
So straight up a still from my video, and that I silk screened on
Oh wow.
paper, and then like here I silk screened it on organza, and I took that film still into my paintings. And this is a really fragile fabric, and now it's showing this image of this fragile moment on this island. And this was also one of the first, not the first time, but I went back to incorporating found images or images that I shot or photographed or recorded, and then infusing them into my painting. And I used to, again, there was like a weird stigma about that before. And I did it a little bit at Ohio State with older magazines. I don't know if you remember, like I had 60s magazines that I was cutting out, but I don't know, the urge came back. And yeah, just materially, it became this metaphor. And I also, now the way that I think about priming my canvases, right? I often talk in these terms of having islands of gesso or islands of primer, where, for example, here, this is an island of gesso, and I know that I can paint on top of this with oil paint. This area is left raw, so this is more for water-based work and staining work. And it creates a push and pull effect where the raw fabric or canvas takes the color in, and then the areas that I'm gessoing, the color is bold and pops more because I'm using oil paint, and it has a different kind of body to it. And I'm still processing this way of working. It's still very much impacting the way that I work now.
Is there language in this one on the lower left?
Yes. So language, similar to what I was saying about fragmented thoughts, right? So I'm bilingual. I can read other languages, but can't speak them. So I speak mostly English and Russian. And I moved to the United States when I was 9 from Uzbekistan. And I became Americanized really quickly, but I still have these 9-year-old thoughts and phrases that are still circulating. And, sometimes when I freestyle or, just do something impromptu, it's Russian language that comes in, and it's the fragmentation of that thought or that language. So it's rare that I will put a clear, legible sentence. Often I'm combining languages, almost like making these codex fusions. And I remember reading this book, the Flame Alphabet, that really, actually, when I was in Texas, my friend recommended it. Oh my God, not Justin. It's gonna come to me. Oh, I'm so embarrassed. He was my fellow resident. He was wonderful. Josh Bernstein, who recommended this book, and it was about a world where language becomes toxic and people start getting sick from reading or hearing language, and it becomes the journey of this one person to find a different way to communicate in a way that doesn't make us sick. So yeah,
am I right in remembering that you also you at least maybe in grad school, like you're pretty interested in hip hop?
Yes, ever since I moved to America, honestly, it was the first American music that I fell in love with that wasn't, my mom's love for the Beatles. Like my mom always loved the Beatles, even when we were in Uzbekistan. But when we got to America, it was like the music that I found on my own that honestly opened me up, just the same way that like interdisciplinary thinking opened me up. And just like the violin, I have a different level of fluency in, when I rhyme to myself. It's like, again, there's no mastering there. It's all just process, and it's part of the the painting machine, if you will. I often come up with titles doing these little impromptu rhymes. But yeah, and sometimes I'll do it in Russian, and most of the time I do it in English. But yeah, it's very influential to me. It's specifically the act of freestyling, like when it's actually real impromptu, spontaneous freestyling. I find the slippages there really interesting. Like I love when I hear someone make a mistake and then try to recover or try to riff on the mistake. I think it's always exciting. Just like, a jazz musician who improvises and sometimes stumbles, and then it's exciting to find them, to watch them find their path back, or maybe just lose it altogether.
Yeah.
Because
So,
and painting is very much that for me.
Zahar, I think an hour is not enough time for us, but
Oh my God, it's already 4:42.
yeah. And this is a good question, and I think it kind of is a good time for it since you're talking about your residency. So Hannah Parrott, who's a lecturer and former MFA at OSU, asks, can you talk a little bit about how you organize images for residency applications? Do you often apply with a combination of performance, sculpture, and painting? Does this often get dictated by the space you're applying to?
That's a great question. And I will tell you, I remember clearly, and it was Eric's generosity. But I remember when I first applied to GAR,
Eric Schnell, the director of GAR, right?
sorry, Eric. Yeah, Eric Schnell is the director. I sent him just paintings. I sent just paintings, but my email, and this is something for everyone, I had my website, just the link to my website underneath my signature in my email. And I got lucky that Eric or Sally or both of them clicked on that website and realized that there was also videos. And they were the ones who convinced me. They're like, hey, do you mind sending us some of these? Do you mind applying with these works as well? And I said, no, I don't mind at all. And I, since then, I tried to do a combination of the interdisciplinary work and the painting specific work when I can. But there are times where I'll just, it really depends on what the application is, right? Some, like say Paula Krasner, right? They're very clear about painters need to apply in under this category. So that's maybe not the application where I'm gonna try to synthesize everything all at once.
And now you're also on the other side of things, because as one of the co-directors of OYG, you're looking at people that are pitching. And I do think it's one of the questions a lot of us have. I mean, I still have this question sometimes, like how how do you do it, right? Like, what are best practices for applying to things like residencies or to shows or whatever? And like, are there any either tips or things that you think are really like real no-nos?
Real no-nos. If we're asking for an artist statement, you should put an artist statement. Don't leave it blank. That's a big no-no. If honestly, so for me, I love looking at applications, and I'm one of the few people that will like watch an entire video because I love moving images. Not all the time, but I will look at, I was like, oh, this person that has a vast practice. Okay, they're submitting video and images. I will absorb that information, but not everyone will.
And not all of your colleagues.
Not all my colleague,
right?
and everyone's different. Again, it's like some people, they need to see consistency. They need to see consistency in terms of the whether it's subject or material or size even or color, right? Other people are more interested in like the growth or the vastness, and you find some kind of link, right? But you could see that this person is exploring other things. So I've been excited by both kind of proposals, ones that are really honed in and focused, and others where there is a thread and a focus, but it's also clear that the artist is searching and exploring. if you're a sculptor or an installation artist, those install shots sometimes might be more effective than just a bunch of details, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes we need to see the overall thing. And I think more and more people are realizing that, you know, you can take a short video in your studio and get close to a work and count that as um, something. At least I've accepted that.
Mhm.
Um, I don't know if that answers the question or if
No,
there's
I
more
think
I
that
can
that's
speak to.
helpful. I mean, this is a sort of one-way street here with our guests, but I think any sort of tips or help that they can hear is really helpful because it's
Make
really
your
intimidating.
take really great images. I mean, this is easier said. Like, if you can, you got to get a photographer. And this is something that I, sometimes have to remind myself too. Like, I have a DSLR. I used to take a lot of my own photos, and they would be detailed, but the lighting and the color would always be off, and then I would have to like re-photograph a lot of that work, and hire a professional. And sometimes just hiring a professional right away will save you a lot of time. And
Uh, Yeah.
is there anything else? Yeah.
That's really helpful. I mean, I have to say the pictures that you just showed us from the stuff at Rauschenberg and after looks amazing.
Well, that was a professional photographer.
And the color is so intense. Do you boost the color in Photoshop and stuff? I mean, like it does
So
seem like they're like really intense.
so when I was color correcting myself, I would try to keep it as natural as possible. I was using a lot of curves. I was
Mhm.
using the curve function in Photoshop, and sometimes I would like click automatic, just this automatic, what do you call it,
Auto balance or whatever.
auto
Yeah.
balance, just to see what they're suggesting. But sometimes they're suggesting you bullshit, and you're like, that's not at all what it looks like. That's not the true color.
Mhm.
So then
Mhm.
you're like, okay, this is really off, and you just have to, you drag the curves, you overlap them, one goes down until the image feels like it's a natural light and natural color. It also took me a really, really long time to do this.
Mhm.
And I would often stay up really late updating my website or whatever application, and lost a lot of sleep because of it. And where a professional knows how to do this really easily, and gave me the great images within a few days. And
I
yeah.
think the other, sorry to rush us along, it's
No, no.
4:49. One of the, we have a hard stop, everyone, at exactly 2 minutes of 5. So, but I think one of the things that I'm certainly interested in about your postgraduate school career is your engagement with Ortega y Gasset. And can you give us like a quick kind of overview of what that's been like for you and
Yeah.
how you got involved with it as well? Because it had started already, but you've been part of that now for many
Since
years.
2014. So I joined when Lisa Mexin and Eliana Anagnos approached me about joining. And it was a funny time to join because we just they at the time they just lost their space in the 1717 Troutman building where Regina Rex was, another artist-run space. And we were nomads for a couple months. So I joined right when we were still uh, curating satellite exhibitions and didn't have a physical gallery. But I I don't know, I really trusted Lisa, and like we just became friends, and there was just something that felt right about it. It was also a funny time to join because that was around the time where we were still paying dues, right? In order to keep this thing running. Everyone was paying a monthly fee so that we can have a space to run. So those couple months where we didn't have a space, all that money went towards our cushioning, our financial cushioning. And then by the time we did get a space, it gave us a few months uh, to operate. And now over time, using whether it's fundraising or every once in a while sales and getting some grants, we're getting to a point where we might be able to pay ourselves a little bit for the work, the physical work that we do. The people that don't live in New York, they are often doing things like PR, updating websites. Me, I have my studio. In fact, I'm just gonna start slowly moving so I don't make anyone dizzy. But I am right. So this is my studio, and then right next door. All right, I'm still moving slowly. We have Ortega y Gasset Projects. All right, and this is the current installation that's up. Okay, Swallowed in the Soft Underbelly, curated by Tiffany Smith and Claire Britt. Tiffany is a local New Yorker, one of the directors, and Claire is one of the original members that's from Chicago. So, yeah, and 3 months later, I joined, and we found this space in Gowanus, and I curated the first show that was in this space. It was 2015. And I do want to speak to that experience of like the first curation. I think that's important because, so in that show, there were 15 artists, and I quickly realized that the only way I pull this off is A, I have to communicate really well, and B, I got to make sure that there's enough space between all the works because there's so many artists. And it was really hard. And I wasn't able to be in my studio for a while after the show. And there was something special that happened once the show closed. And then I'm able to get into my studio, and all of a sudden, this dry spell has a hold of me. And then I was able to hit the ground running, and my work completely shifted. And it's just this thing because curating is an extension of my art practice. And I'm not in the show, or I wasn't in that show, but the people that I gravitated to, the people whose work that inspired me to think. The show was titled Thinking and Touching Time. It had like an Austin Lee right next to Donna Nelson, right? Or Evgenia Barras and Mike Olin, and some OSU alum, Winnie Siddhartha, Mike Ambron, Lauren Reardy. My wife, Nicola Pottinger, was part of that show before she became a member. And there was just something about the decisions I was making as a curator, and I was able to see the way that those same decisions are echoed in my painting practice. So real quickly, if we have a minute or two, I do want to read something where somebody helped me get these thoughts down. Like really what I was having a conversation and they transcribed it. And I'll read it. It talks about the curating and the art making. I think it's a nice way to, if you don't mind.
Well, we're going to get cut off. So I'm just going to, before we do, I'm just going to say this has been totally awesome. And I've had so much fun. The time went by like that. I'm sad that we can't do this for another hour, but
yeah, you and I could talk for a really long time, huh?
If it gets shut off, thank you so much, Zahar. I've really, this has been so fun.
It's a pleasure. All right, I'm gonna read it. All right. Over the years, I have come to appreciate more and more how my curating process is connected to my creative practice. The way I bring a show together mirrors the way I put a painting together. Spatially clustering, isolating, composing, the types of action and thinking that go into hanging a show are the same concerns in my painting. I couldn't paint while curating my first show. The curation was the work. Enacting the same processes on a different canvas. The show itself was the canvas. I am often drawn towards others' work on an instinctual level, a vibe, a resonance, a trace. I can't quite place it, and that's what excites me. It's an initial feeling that I follow, and through the following of that feeling, I can get to a sense of understanding. Painting follows the same instinctual process, lots of physicality, movement, messiness, etc. Then after a few sessions of the painting goes up vertical on the wall. It had previously been horizontal on the floor or on a table. The prep for oil paint, it was initially water-based. The thinking starts to creep into the making. Movements are slower now, really starting to look at the work where before was not really looking, but more feeling. Things become more specific. Words might start to come in once painting gets up on the wall. This is my practice, believing and leaning into it when I don't necessarily know everything about it. Trusting, leaping, dancing. Higher level thinking happens after the fact, but the creative act itself is generally a blank zone, state of intuition, like meditation, a dropping in, an openness to receive, a yearning to connect, a desire to collaborate, a moment to appreciate, thinking through making. In reflecting on the process of putting together a show, which pulls from so many different experiences and influences, I can only say this: something can be specific but not developed, which then continues to evolve because of some of the things that you decide to let in. When you say yes, or when you are open, when you can be open, sometimes you have to block shit, but when you're open and when you trust what is coming in, it can both change things and still maintain the integrity of the original thing. That's jazz, that's freestyle, that's improvisation, but there's still structure to it. Similar to the work of an educator. You have a lesson, but things happen and you have to adapt. This is creation and this is curation. This is life.
That's beautiful.
I made it.
Thanks, Zahar. I'm going to now turn it back over to Scott, who's going to wrap us up, but thank you so much.
Oh my God, my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Zahar and George both, thank you so much for a very engaging conversation. Zahar, I've jotted a note here as you were just doing that last reading, this trusting, leaping, dancing, just so vivid and such great advice for, again, not only what you do, but what so many do in the arts, and really powerful. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. And of course, you do us proud as one of Ohio State's own.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
It's a
you're very,
pleasure.
very welcome. For all of you who've joined us today, we hope you've enjoyed this. There'll be a follow-up email that includes some information about George Rush's exhibit that we talked about and Zahar's information that he referenced earlier. Thank you again so much for being with us. And as we like to say here at Ohio State, stay close to the arts. Bye now.
Thank you. All right. Take care, everyone.